So interestingly, right now there's a huge push to bring immigrants into Japan. The
Really?
globalists are trying to take it down the way that they're taking down the West, and it's terrifying. It's a bad thing. We know about Abe being publicly assassinated a year ago, um, by a guy who had like he was like a trans activist, and so unfortunately their culture is now being attacked in this regard as well. They're obviously, we always think of them as like the perfect ethno-nationalist state, in so many ways, which may be true. But I think a broader and more interesting way to approach this question is to look at the way that we view Japan as outsiders, as Westerners. And there's a kind of like, when I went to Japan, I suppose I was, kind of a Japanophile, that kind of love of the culture, the intoxication that you get with all aspects of their culture, which is very charming, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. I've never been a manga or anime fan. That's not the type of guy that I am. I'm more into Japanese theater, Japanese literature, film, um, and Zen Buddhism specifically was the real reason I went to Japan, was to study Zen Buddhism. Fortunately, my college had an exchange program, and this university in Japan had an art program, so it matched up just right. There's a university called Kansai Gaidai. Um, it's in Osaka. In Japan, it's nationally known as maybe the most famous college for foreigners to come and study Japanese culture, etc. So it was a big deal. I was 20 years old. I went through an exchange program. It was my first time ever on an airplane, and and so you arrive, but you arrive with students from all countries from around the world, mostly European though. So that's where I first met British people, like English people and French people, and people from places like Latvia and stuff. So we had like a giant dorm that we all stayed in. And
Was that university?
Yeah, at university in Japan, for that year that I stayed there. So you're always an outsider. It's kind of, it's hard to explain. If you don't speak the language, that's one aspect of it, but it goes far, far deeper than that. I would say that the Japanese envy us, that you look at how well that they copy our culture, but yet they can't produce that culture. So what is it? Why are they obsessed with us in this way? So it's because they lack the freedom and the creativity that we have. So it's we have there's a lot of sort of Japanophiles in our sphere, etc. But actually, I would say their infatuation with the West is maybe 10 times stronger, and it's even coupled with a kind of self-loathing that the Japanese have. It'd be more of a danger to their culture if whites moved in the in the hundreds of thousands, because then they would be attracted to us and want to mate with us, and then lose their ethnic You get the general idea. I mean, our values and our civilizations are on par in many ways, although they are extremely different from us. So like once you kind of recognize that the Japanese themselves feel that their own culture is very oppressive to them, and it's baked into everything, into the language, into business, martial arts, family, relationships. It's kind of tragic once you get to actually understand that, like, to an ordinary Japanese person, you have like a tiny sliver of freedom in your life during college, where you kind of get to just go do whatever you want. But prior to that, you go to school all day, and then you go to school at night, and then after college you have to join a company. You got to get married, and there's all these duties that are laid on you that are like really heavy burdens to them. So again, that's why they look at us. So, like for example, when I lived in New York City, I taught English at a Japanese corporation, actually. So I did that for 2 years. It was a fascinating experience. Um, and most of my students were Japanese businessmen that were put in New York City, in the offices in New York City, and like every year or 6 months, they would get switched out with other, Japanese businessmen, and so they would have to come and take English classes, blah blah blah. So that was fascinating. But I remember one time, and this really says a lot about what I think of the Japanese, or what people can learn about the Japanese through our eyes. So I'm in a one-on-one English class, and the student comes in, and he's this huge karate guy. He's built like a Mongolian. Like he's just really not like the usual small guy that we think of as a Japanese. Like he's just built like a brick house. And not only that, he has this really fierce quality to him, very samurai type of guy, and almost intimidating, to be honest. And like he's just super serious. So I go through the lesson, and he says everything perfectly, and then we finish early. So I'm like, okay, you did everything flawlessly, so you can have like free conversation now. You've got another 10-15 minutes. What do you want to talk about? Like that. Yeah. And then the very first thing he said was, I envy you. And I'm sitting on the other end of the table. I'm like a young guy in my 20s and living the life in New York City, having a good time. But essentially, I'm like a poor artist, though. I'm going to Kung Fu school at Shaolin Temple, having a good time. But like, this guy's super wealthy and high status and whatever. And I'm like, you envy me? Like, well, how does that make sense? From that kind of perspective. So he just looked at me and he says, you are free.
So what is it about his culture that makes him not free?
So everything. If you kind of have to take a step back and look at the history of Japan as well. But here you've got an island culture. There's several islands, frankly, and then all the clans fighting, and a very difficult history of survival. You've got earthquakes and typhoons. They've had a very difficult history in terms of survival. So what they do is they've structured their society in such a way where you as an individual are on the bottom of the priority list, that all of your duties to your family, your clan, etc., come above that. And so when you're born into this kind of slavery to that, so that everything you do in life, you just have to do those things. And so even today, economically and culturally, there's still all of those things are in place, and they're baked right into the language. So people, when they meet you, they want to identify quickly, how old are you married, how much money do you make, and these things, they need to know where they stand on the status scale with you in order to know how to interact with you. Now, we're aware of that. I think maybe England has a lot more of that class consciousness than Americans, of course, but I don't think we're anywhere near as plugged into that type of a rigid class system. And it's not just a class system, it's more than that. Hard to explain. But again, like you're just required to do everything you're told to do in order to, keep the family face, if you will, to have the status, etc. And when you live in a homogenous society like that, there's no way to distinguish the differences between people. Everyone is pretty much the same. And so if you have a better education, you can get a better job, and therefore you're more high status. You see what I'm saying? So, and the opposite is true. If you decide to, I don't know, you can't work within that system, you're going to struggle financially. You'll find it hard to find a wife and have, children to take care of you, and you're ashamed to your family. It's pretty harsh. It's pretty harsh. So in America anyway, we don't have any of that that is comparable. So I think that's what's behind the curtain. We Westerners, we go there and we're all completely enamored, and it's an incredibly beautiful culture. I've had so many marvelous experiences there, but eventually I did recognize like there's a real deep sadness there. Um, the people who are artists and eccentrics in Japan are way overboard. Like they're
Really?
extremely eccentric, like because it's like a binary, that like if you're eccentric within this highly conformative society, if you will, then you're so far out that it's pretty wild. That's very interesting because like there's pretty open racism. I don't think racism is the proper word, but there's an open rejection of blacks in and anyone who's like not white, essentially. Like whites are considered like rock stars over there.
Really?
Oh God, yeah. It's I mean, this is obviously a little touchy discussion with like certain people in our sphere, what have you, but it's just a fact. Now, part of that is just simply due to the fact that they're living in this extremely homogenous Far Eastern culture, and they mostly see us on TV and movies. So when you see a white person, you just associate them with like action films and like, oh, he's so handsome, or da 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 da, power and just excitement and all these things. And it's a fantasy that they can't really reach or live. They can pretend it. They can, have like that subculture of guys that dress up like Elvis and stuff, that like go dance in the park to like 50s music or have motorcycles. Like, that's so like, it's fun, and it's cool and whatever, fun for them. Although for us, it seems totally bizarre. But yeah, you will experience that when you're there. Now, when I went there, it was some years ago, and things change over time. Like the more foreigners go to Asia, for example, the more these cultures get to see like the truth of it. There's a lot of what you call Asia bums, which are just like white guys that just want to go for a good time and are not really representatives of the race. They're not like the guys that you want to represent you as an Englishman or an American.